Okay. So thank you to everybody for joining. We are continuing our shiur on the tefillah. Last week we began with an introduction to Pesukei de Zimra, and our introduction was a historical coverage, an early history of the Pesukei de Zimra, because most of the early history of the Pesukei de Zimra is shrouded in mystery. It's very nebulous. It's fairly ancient. And what we uncovered, to recap, just if we're going to recap, what we uncovered is as follows. As far as we can tell, with the Pesukei de Zimra, the earliest custom for reciting psalms before the tefillah was called Gemirat Hallel, or Gomrim Hallel. This is mentioned by Rabbi Yossi in Masechet Shabbat Kuf Yud Chet Amud Bet, where he says, Yehei chalkimi gomrei Hallel b'kol yom. And 200 years later, the Gemara asks, and what is that? That must be Pesukei de Zimra. So we can see that in Eretz Yisrael, in the time of the Tanaim, they had a custom, or they began a custom, that before the institutionalized statutory prayer, they would begin saying psalms. Why exactly would they do these mizmorim of Tehillim? We don't know. Different theories abound. Some say because of the drasha of Reb Simlai that came later, that there's a tradition that one has to pray to God with praises first. Some say it is because one has to pray to God with a gladdened heart. And some say that it's a carryover from the Beis Hamikdash. While in the Beis Hamikdash, the operating liturgy was mostly psalms, was mostly Tehillim. So when the statutory liturgy, the Amidah and the Birchas Kriya Shema were instituted, they naturally were accompanied by a preparatory period of saying psalms, like almost like a meditative introduction to the Pesukei de Zimra. Now, in the time of the Tanaim, our knowledge of exactly what they said, how they said it, is unknown. The Bavli only calls it Pesukei de Zimra, and we know from later sources, that much later sources, honestly, that the Babylonian custom was, the custom of the yeshivos in Bavel, was to, I'm going to begin sharing my screen, was to begin the custom of the yeshivos in Bavel was to begin with the last six mizmorim, or to contain the last six mizmorim of Tehillim, from Kuf Mem Hey all the way to Kuf Nun. They would say from Ashrei all the way to Halukal Bikocho, and that was their Pesukei de Zimra. That's what we know about the Minhag Habavli. The Minhag, and eventually at some point they bookended this custom with brachot. We don't know precisely when this was bracketed, and they did a bracha in the beginning and a bracha at the end, but at some point the bracha of Baruch She'Amar came into being. As far as the Nusach HaYerushalmi, we know that the Yeshivos in Eretz Yisrael had a different minhag. Their minhag was not to say the 6 Halalukas every day, rather it was to say the 15 Shir Hamalot every day. They would start with Kuf Chaf, and they would do 17 Mizmorim all the way to Kuf Lamed Vav, and include Halal Hagadol, as we all know, Hodu Lashem Kitov Kilo Lam Chasto. And they also bookended it with a different bracha called Birkat Hashir. So let's begin where we left off, and let's see how the Rishonim and Gaonim and others try to paint the picture that they have of how Baruch She'Amar came into being. So we're going to begin with, I'm going to share my screen here to another slide. Give me a second. I'm going to share my screen to you with the Siddur of Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon says as follows. Let me make sure the share is working. Yes. Okay. Sadia Gaon says, V'it nadiva umatenu. This is a translation from the Arabic. Our nation has volunteered to read psalms from the book of praises to God, and before and after them 2 blessings. Why did they institute do this? Meaning because because the believer in God blesses him for all those good things that happen to him throughout the morning from when he wakes up until he begins to pray. As I will explain to you in a separate chapter aside from the prayers. This separate chapter, I believe, was lost. It was the introduction. And now we're going to see Rav Sadia Gaon's version of Baruch She'Amar. But what's important to notice is that Rabbi Sadia Gaon doesn't seem to really know precisely when or how Baruch She'Amar was instituted. He leaves it at a very nebulous v'tikna la'asot kach, or v'tnadva umatenu, right? That we volunteered these mizmorim, and there was an institution of brachot, but he doesn't seem to know when exactly or where exactly they happened, meaning that by his time, which is roughly the 9th century, Sadia Gaon already already believes that the origins of this are nebulous. So we're talking about a bracha which must be at least a few hundred years old for him to no longer have a knowledge of its earliest composition. Now, the first mention of it is of course, Rav Moshe Gaon. The first person who mentions it by name is not Rav Sadia Gaon, but Rav Moshe Gaon, in one of the tshuvot from Rav Nachman Gaon that we've mentioned a few times. He says, Rabbi Moshe Gaon, they asked Rabbi Natronai, what do you do if you come late to davening? And you need to catch up to Baruch Hu. So he says, well, you say Baruch She'Amar, you say Ashrei, you say the last Hallelujah, and then you close it, meaning you say Yishtabach, and then you go on, and that's what he heard from his Rebbeim. So if Rabbi Moshe Gaon, who lived in the 820s, was saying, or so who ruled Surah in the 820s, was telling us that he heard this from his Rebbeim, then it's definitely Baruch She'Amar is at least, of course, older than him, and the name Baruch She'Amar clearly predates him. So that's the first time it's mentioned by name. But what we'll notice here on the screen of the Nusach of Rav Sadia Gaon is that his Nusach of Baruch She'Amar doesn't begin with Baruch She'Amar v'haya olam as we're familiar with it today. His version begins without that whole introduction. And that's important to think about, because if you think about the bracha Baruch She'Amar, you'll notice that it's unlike any other bracha we have in all of our portfolio of brachos. And we say a lot of brachos. We're the Jewish people. We have to say at least 100 a day. However, the Baruch She'Amar is very different than any other bracha because it begins with an entire poetic introduction. Baruch She'Amar v'haya olam Baruch Hu, Baruch Omar v'oseh, Baruch Gozen Kayim, Baruch Oseh Bereishit. We have an entire introduction before we get to the actual Baruch Atah Hashem portion. But Rav Sadia Gaon doesn't do that. Rav Sadia Gaon goes ahead and begins immediately with Baruch Atah Hashem, the second portion. Elokeinu melech haolam, hakel av rachaman hagadol v'akadosh hamulal b'fi amo, Beit Yisrael meshubach umfar tamid b'lashon kol chasidav avadav b'shirei David avdecha, nehalalach Hashem Elokeinu b'shvachot u'b'zmirot, nodeka, nishabechach, v'nefarach, nomemach niachetcha, naktishach, naskir shemcha b'zacharim Elokeinu Elokeinu yachad. Baruch Atah Hashem, melech mehulal b'divrei shir v'tishbachot le'olam va'ed. Fascinating. You can see the similarity to our Baruch She'Amar today for anybody who's familiar with the bracha. And there's a couple of expansions here and there. Now, what the most interesting thing, in my opinion, is not that just that he starts with the second half, but that he has another version of it later on. So let's start with the obvious. If he begins with the second half of Baruch She'Amar, most scholars have looked at this and said, wait a second, that means that this is separate from the first half. And most likely the first half was added later. It's a poetic introduction and it was added later. And that's why Rav Sadia Gaon doesn't have it, because many Jewish communities simply didn't say it. So let's move on and let's look. He's in the Tefillot Liachid. But when we move on to the Tefillot Litzibur, when we move on to the Tefillos which you say if you have 10 men or more, what does he say? He says, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech hakel av harachman hagadol v'hakadosh hamulel b'fi amo Beit Yisrael v'onim amen. And they say amen. That's the entire introduction to Pesukei Zimra, a much shorter version of Baruch She'Amar. Now, not to leave out any information, the truth is that Sadia Gaon is aware of the poetic introduction of Baruch She'Amar. But in his time in the 9th century in Surah, he is telling you he's going to tell you what they did back then. On Shabbat, they would add the poetic introduction. Let me show you here on page Kufir Ches in the Siddur of Sadia Gaon. Baruch She'Amar v'haya ha'olam. He says, "B'birkat Pesukei Zimra shomrim b'Shabbat b'boker mosifim b'tchilata b'lashon zeh." Right, in the Pesukei Zimra on Shabbat, we add to the beginning of the bracha, Baruch She'Amar v'Hayalam Baruch Hu. Now notice here that it's much longer than the typical Baruch She'Amar that you might say. Baruch Omer V'Oseh, Baruch Gozer M'Kayim, Baruch Merachim Al HaBeriot, Baruch Ma'avir Afila Al Mevi Ora, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael, Baruch Mishlem Sechatov L'Yireav, Baruch Hu, Baruch She'en Lefanav Lo Avlav Lo Shicha Lo Chazav Lo Mirmav Lo Masa Panim Lo Mikach Shochad, Baruch Kel Chaylad V'Kem L'Nesach, Baruch Ata Shem Kim HaCholam Hakel Av Rachman HaGadol V'HaKadosh, until the end of the bracha. So clearly, Rav Saadia Gaon was aware of this earlier poetic introduction of Baruch She'Amar, which was the introduction for the bracha. He simply didn't use it during the weekday. So at least that was not his minhag, either from Egypt or from Surah. Now, a couple of decades later, or later, like a decade and a half before, I think, Rav Amram Gaon has the Baruch She'Amar, but he has it for daily use. And he has the Baruch She'Amar very similarly to the way we have it, as far as Daniel Goldschmidt is able to uncover it. He has Baruch She'Amar ve'Olam Baruch Hu, Baruch Merachim Gozem K'Hem, Baruch Poseh V'Shit, Baruch Merachim Al Haaretz, Baruch Merachim Al HaBriot, Baruch Mishalem Sechatov L'Yireav, Baruch Kelchai La'ad V'Kam Al Netzach. Did I read that right? Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. That's essentially Rav Amram Gaon's version, and the end also ends very similarly to the way Rav Saadia Gaon's ends. So as you can see, Rav Saadia Gaon and Rabbi Saadia Gaon and Rabbi Amram Gaon both are familiar with the introduction of Baruch She'Amar. However, they are not familiar with, Rabbi Saadia Gaon is not familiar with using it during the weekday, and it seems clear to them that Baruch She'Amar is a poetic introduction of some sort. Now, there was a famous traveler named Natan HaBavli. Natan HaBavli we know very little about. He was a historian, a Jewish historian, and a traveler that lived in roughly the 10th century. The only thing we know about Natan HaBavli is that he traveled to Surah for some reason. He visited the yeshivot in Bavel, and I'll display on my screen a relief in the Diaspora Museum in Eretz Yisrael, where they have a relief trying to portray Rav Ashi teaching 70 students, the Kala, right? You have the rows of students in the yeshiva of Surah. And a lot of what we know about the inner workings of the yeshiva and Surah comes from this record, this historical record that Rav Nosson HaBavli actually provides us with. And there's various different versions of his story. It's translated from the Arabic, and so it's a little bit awkward. But he says a very important thing, and he was witness to an episode where they were coronating, I should say, the new Reish Galuta in Bavel, meaning the new leader of the Jewish people. He was the new political leader, not the new religious leader. And so they were going to do a coronation for the new Rosh Galut, or the head of the exile, so to speak, the exilarch. And this coronation ceremony was very grand because he's a very powerful person, and getting it is a big honor. So this ceremony was really grand. And in the middle of his description of how the ceremony goes, he mentioned something kind of interesting. He says like this. He says that on Shabbat, they would have a whole procession to take him to shul. And then they would say, Rosh Galut atzmo hayem mechusav b'makom Rosh Yeshivot v'abochrim omdim tachat hamigdal, or you would have the Reish Galuta would be like hidden, like for the drama to expose him later, behind the Rosh Yeshiva. And then they would have young lads who knew how to sing. And what would they do? On Shabbat, they would be in the Beit HaKnesset. V'chazan matchil, the Chazan would begin the services, because this is a very special Shabbat. So they would begin the services with Baruch She'Amar, with the tefillah of Baruch She'Amar. V'habachurim oni nachrav al kol davar v'davar bin Baruch She'Amar Baruch Hu. And the lads, the young men who would be the choir, would answer to every verse of Baruch She'Amar with Baruch Hu. Like they hand off Pesukei Zimra to different people, just like the Moroccans do today. And here goes the rest of the story, which is just a procession of the tefillah. Now, some scholars have cautioned how to use this letter of Rav Nosson HaBavli, because if he was a visitor, he might have mistaken something that he saw when he was visiting as something that was special when it was really normal, and he could have seen something that was normal, but he thought was really special. Did I say that correctly? Something that was normal, he thought was special. He could have thought something was special, but was really normal. So it's not clear if this was the way they did it every Shabbat, or if they did this just for the inauguration of the Reish Galuta. Now, Rav Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport was a Rav in the 1800s in Europe, and he was very excited by this what's it called, a letter for this historical document from Nassan Habavli. He was involved in the Wissenschaft. He was one of the Orthodox people who were very excited about Jewish studies. And he saw this and he said, you know what? This is brilliant. This tells us that because they would say Baruch She'Amar and then everyone would answer Baruch Hu, this tells us that Baruch She'Amar was originally a poem. It was a poem written to be recited responsively. It was like an introduction to the Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Mula B'Tishbachot at the end. And sorry, Kel Avrahman HaGadol HaKadosh at the end. And that's why that's how it was that was the genesis of Baruch She'Amar. It began as a poetic introduction to the first bracha, and we can learn it from here. Many other scholars rejected this because the truth is, it's attractive to say that, but the words don't support it. The words of the and I'll just read them again. The words of the letter, I don't speak Arabic, but the Hebrew says that they would reply to every section of it Baruch Hu, but nowhere in there does it ever make it as if Baruch She'Amar is something new or novel, or there's some special merit to having such a poet. It speaks about a poem. It speaks about Baruch She'Amar very matter of factly. So they don't really align. Most scholars don't align with Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport's understanding here that it began its life as a piyut, as strictly a hymn which they would recite to introduce the Pesukei de Zimra. So, what other ideas do we have as to how this might have evolved? So Ismail Bogan, who famously wrote the prayer in the let me take my give me a second. Sorry, I don't have a screenshot for you, but Jewish Liturgy, a Comprehensive History, which is originally in German. He has a different approach. He believes that the Baruch She'Amar is really a messianic prayer, meaning it's a tefillah about the Geula. It's a tefillah that hopes for Mashiach. And this tefillah is kind of like a conclusion, a concluding prayer of asking for Mashiach based on the psukim that you had previously. Because the services in the morning began with Atahu Hashem Elokeinu, not began, after you finish L'olam Yehei Adam Shemayim B'Seiter Kivag Aloi, prior to Baruch She'Amar, you'll have the Atahu Hashem Elokim, and the Atahu Hashem Elokim section ends with Be'et Ahi Avi Atchem, Be'et Kavetzi Atchem, Ki Etein Atchem L'Shem L'Tila, B'chol HaMei Haaretz, V'shuvi Et Shavutechem Le'inechem Amar Hashem. The end of that introductory paragraph of the pre-Pesukei de Zimra, the L'olam Yehei Adam section, ends with a messianic tone. And because it ends with a hope for the messianic redemption, therefore we add Baruch She'Amar as like a conclusion. It was originally added. Baruch She'Amar v'Hayalam Baruch Hu was a conclusion to those earlier verses. Now, personally, I don't see it because in the versions of Baruch She'Amar that I have seen, I've never seen the language be so strong to invoke necessarily a messianic tone. I do hear what he's saying, like the Baruch goes are Makayim and a few of the other terms in some of the expanded versions, but I will defer respectfully. He's seen a lot more manuscripts than I have. He's a lot smarter than I am, so I would defer respectfully to his opinion that he believes that there is a tone of it which is Mashiachos, that it has some messianic Geula redemption kind of tones into the tefillah. Now, the earlier parts, he does point out that the earlier texts that lack the introduction verify that it's a later expansion or some sort of hymn, but he says that, listen, think about it. If you have the first part resembling the brachos of Hallel, and also it's not very relevant to the second part, it must be a much later expansion. Now, one of the things he brings in, which to illustrate his point, is really fascinating, and I want to show this to you. Many Jews today, not many, but unfortunately less than we would like, many Jews today are familiar with the term of the Greek Jews, but the Greek Jews, unfortunately, the Romaniot communities, were wiped out by Hitler in the Holocaust. However, some of their Torah and some of their tefillah still remains at least on let me see if I'm sharing the correct screen. I am. Okay, so a lot of their Torah and a lot of their tefillah remains, but unfortunately, this minhag of the Greek community is not what's it called? Is not no longer practiced. But he brings from here that he shows how the last pesukim here of the Pesukei de Zimra were deliberately added, Baruch Hashem Etzion Shulchan Yerushalayim Hallelujah, that deliberately are finishing the sections in what's it called? The sections in the Machzor that end off with messianic tropes. He believes that that this Machzor here, and I won't go into the specific verses, but this is an early. This is from 1523 in Venice, by the way. This manuscript I'm showing you, it's not a manuscript, I should say. It's an early printed book, and one of their earliest printed books. But because the psukim before seem to be speaking about, in his view, be speaking about redemption, and Baruch She'Amar follows it, he sees that as a support for his opinion. Now, if you look at the version of the Romaniot, just for fun, look how expanded it is. You'll see Baruch Hu ke'achad mi yishivenu Baruch Hu, Baruch zanu mfanes lakol, Baruch chaylad v'kem lanetzach, Baruch tovu metiv lakol, Baruch yachid ba'olamo, Baruch Hu, Baruch kavod mimikomo, Baruch v'lo ya'ef v'lo yagea, ein chaker letvunato, Baruch Hu, Baruch mafil afelo mevi ora, Baruch noten le'av koach, uleino ni matzmai arbe Baruch Hu, Baruch somech noflim, v'rof yecholim, umatir asurim, Baruch oseg dolot, adin cheker v'neflaot, adin mispar, Baruch Hu, Baruch podem atzil, Baruch poal yishot bekerev haaretz, Baruch tzadik v'chasid b'chol aderot, Baruch Hu. We can go on. Oh boy, this is long. Baruch Karav l'chol Karav emet. Baruch Ramin Yisa Shochein Ad Kadosh Shemo Baruch Hu. Baruch Shein Lefanav Lo Avlav Lo Shecha. Right, this we saw. Baruch Tamim Chol Rachav. Vivarach Hashem Kvadecha V'Mormal Kol Baruch Tehillah. Ki Hashem Kal Yon Or Melech Gadol Karas. Kol Haaretz Yishtachu L'Chav Yizamru L'Shimcha Elyon. Whew, that was a mouthful. Sorry for anybody listening on the on the recording. Regardless, he takes the Romaniot edition, and he goes to town. And he believes that the Greek edition will prove to you that the gist of Baruch She'Amar is a messianic hope and a messianic prayer for redemption, which follows the Pesukei de Zimra before it, or I shouldn't call them Pesukei de Zimra, but relatively speaking, the introductory Berchos HaShachar before it. Okay, that's probably the more correct term. But now here's one more thing you have to see just before we go on. The Romaniot community was also fiercely, tenaciously hanging on to their older, hold up, did I just lose everything? I might have. They were tenaciously holding on to their earlier minhagim. And the Greek community followed earlier, they followed a lot of the minhag Eretz Yisrael. And the minhag Eretz Yisrael was to say, as we said earlier, the Birchas Hashir, and not to say the Baruch She'Amar. And if you look in the minhag of Shabbos, the Greek communities actually do this. Look at this. They as we mentioned last week, some in the later times, the communities in Eretz Yisrael would say Birchas Hashir in addition to Pesukei de Zimra. So here you have that exact thing. You have the Greek communities on Shabbat saying the Birchas Hashir with the Pesukei de Zimra. And I'll just show it to you. Titala melech b'fi kol shishim v'shrei levav k'erev Yisrael yitroma mishtabach shimcha malkeinu b'makelot Yisrael ha'machai yitbar shimcha v'zechacha. And I won't go through the whole thing because I'll bore everybody who's listening to the recording, but it ends Baruch Hashem melech mihula b'shvachot. And then, hold up, where's the end of it? I know there was an end of it here. Sorry. I'm probably missing it with my eyes. I think they ended it. What did they say? Here it is. Is this it? No, sorry. Okay, I must have lost it with my eyes. But originally, I was able to find the beginning and end of this Birchas Hashir. Okay, let's move onward. Now, in walks Rabbi Yosef Heinemann in the 60s. And Rabbi Yosef Heinemann sees Elbogen's work. He sees Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport's work, and he sees everybody's work. He's really the follow-up scholar in the field of Jewish liturgy. And as we've discussed before, he takes the form critical approach, while Elbogen would take the historical, historiographical, the philological approach to research. Let me admit, Gary. Hold up. Okay. Hi, Gary. How you doing? Welcome. So in walks Rabbi Yosef Heinemann, and Rabbi Yosef Heinemann takes the form critical approach to studying the tefillah. And he publishes a sefer called HaTefillah B'Tkufas HaTanoim HaMeirayim, which is later translated into English, Prayer in the Talmud with Richard Saracen. So he takes this approach of the form critical method to understanding liturgy. And you have to look at the content, the structure, and the form of every prayer to get a better understanding of why it was instituted. And he has a very important yesod. He has a very important idea which he establishes. And this is something we've discussed briefly before by Kaddish, but we have to go into it a little bit more now. He believes that there are two forms of prayer composition. There were prayers that were composed in order to pray, as silly as it sounds. There were prayers that were composed, that were written for the sake of worship, prayer for prayer itself. And that's what he would call tefillat Beit HaKnesset, tefillot which were written for the tefillah of Beit HaKnesset. While there's another class of prayer that was written not so much to accompany prayer, but really to accompany Torah study. If a group of people were going to read from the Torah, expound from the Torah, give a drasha, or do kriyas Torah, they would say certain prayers that would accompany that study and that exposition. So there's a tremendous difference in the nature of the forms of prayers that were written for the study hall, Tfilat Beit HaMidrash and Tfilot Beit HaKnesset. The most important distinction, of course, is that they were not written to be statutory. They were written, in a sense, to be natural. Many of them were ad hoc. They were just ways that the preacher himself would begin his study lesson. He would begin by saying, let's say, a Yehei Shmo HaGadol Mevarach, or he would begin with Ala Kol Yitgadal, or he would begin with any form of introduction. I'm trying to think off the bat, but I'm going to read them for you for a second. And he would begin with any of these introductions to the to his study period, and then he would end off the study period with more words of prayer and words of praise. We discussed recently that in Kaddish that the rule was, and there were exceptions, but the rule was that when you were ending a study session, you would end with a messianic doxology, meaning a praise rubric which hoped for the redemption. And Kaddish is the prime example of that. These messianic doxologies were called in Aramaic nechemata, nechematot, which is why in Kaddish we say Leila min kol bechatash yatav v'tishbechat v'nechemata, because this was a whole genre of prayer that was composed for the ending the Beit HaMidrash study. Now, another form which is very very blatant in the Beit HaMidrash, in the Tefillot Beit HaMidrash style, is that they are in the third person. You just have to think about that for a second. Almost all of the tefillah that we say, proper tefillah, whether it's stuff that was instituted by Rabbi Gamliel B'Yavne or by the Anshe Knesset Hakdola, most of that proper prayer is written in the second person. We speak to God directly. Whether it's Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam in Shmona Esrei, Elokeinu V'Kevatenu, and we say Atachon in Ladam Dat, Ata Kadosh, whether it's in Yotzer Or, many of the statutory prayers that were written for worship speak to God in the second person. But speaking of God in the third person is really foreign to at least to original institutionalized statutory prayer. We just don't see in worship prayer. We don't see in synagogue liturgy that we refer to God in the third person. However, in Beis Medrash tefillos, in the study hall prayers, it's very, very common. And I can give you so many examples. But let's first start with some examples of the ways they would begin the drasha. You would have let's see here. Baruch, hold up. This is just the ways they would begin the sermon. We have this in Targum Yerushalmi. We have, this is in Aramaic, of course, because it was the colloquial. Then very often, if they would say the word HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they would add other epithets. They would say, but let's say HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yehei Shmo HaGadol Mevarach L'Olam L'Olamei Olamim, or Baruch Hu She'ein L'Fanav Lo Avla V'Lo Shicha V'Lo Maso Panim. Right? We have all of these examples where within the study they would interject with words of praise. Here's an example here in Tana Devei Zuta, which is going to be striking to any of you here. And am I sharing my screen? Which screen am I sharing? Yeah, beautiful. Here's an example that will be striking to you in a Tana Devei Zuta, and this is what we borrow a lot of Baruch She'Amar from. Baruch She'Amar v'haya olam Baruch Hu. Baruch oseh ma'aseh bereshit. Baruch Omar v'oseh. Baruch kosem kein. Baruch shezachar et rishonot v'hevir et hachronot. Shehaya lo lamar nerdi natan sechon v'lo lamar natan recho. Let's give another example. We have in the Gemara in Brachot. No, this is not really. This I could show you, but this is not really a base medrash prayer. This is just saying that it's a bracha. If you see the destruction of Babel, you would say Baruch Omer ve'oseh gozer Makayim. We could see that this language was already used in the time of the Amoraim. Okay, and then we have. I'm sorry, I'm finding it with my eyes. Right, we have Baruch She'en lefanav lo avlav lo shichav lo maso panim. Okay, let me jump out of these languages. Most of the languages I'm showing you here on the screen are just proofs that the Amoraim were familiar with these languages. But if I'm going to look at actual tefillos, and I'm sorry for the distraction, but if we look at the actual tefillos, a lot of them are striking. Like you would have a typically, let's say we have a tefillah from prayer, like you hear it someone Hashem Elokeinu v'Kevotenu. That's third person, right? You hear someone Hashem Elokeinu v'Kevotenu, the God of our God. Not third person. I'm sorry. And you hear someone Milfanecha Hashem Elokai v'Kevotai, right? We begin a second person prayer. That comes from synagogue liturgy. But when you transfer it to the Beis Hamedrash, you have a completely different type of hiratzon. You have the hiratzon gets changed into, shoot, I wish I could find it. Sorry to everybody on the recording, but I'm a little sick and not operating at my fastest here. Going. Does anybody here can help me? We say it here at Son we say this one after Kriyat Torah. Right? You switch the Hiratzon format from the first person from the second person to the third person when it comes to the Beit HaMidrash, when we're actually going to say something by the Sefer Torah. We also have Avarachamim Hu Yirachem Amamusim. V'Rachaman Baruch Hu Yachzir Shvitenu V'Shvita Mo Kol Beit Yisrael. That's the Taimani version. We have, of course, Al Dayit Barach V'Shtabach Shmei Kula Ditra Ibn Ve'et Tzadikaya. Oh, here it is. Yiratzom Fnei Alavinu Shbashamayim L'Konen Beit Chayenu L'Hashiv Et Shechinatenu B'Tochenu B'Mheira. We have Yukum Purkan, famously in Shemaya, Kamei Shemaya. We have the Yukum Purkan, which comes before, Min Kamei Shemaya, which comes again in the third person in the name of heaven. And at the end, if you think about it, by Uvalat Zion, we have Baruch Elokeinu Shubaranu L'Chvodo V'Vdilanu Min HaToim, right? Again in the third person, because it's ending after Uvalat Zion, which is another messianic doxology, and this is almost like a Birchas HaTorah at the end of, it's like a Birchas HaTorah at the end of Torah study. So, in his view, there are many ways to identify a tefillah from the Beis HaMedrash. Very often the languages, right? The form you'll have it's in the third person. You'll have words like Kadosh Baruch Hu. You'll have words like of Harachaman. You would have words like, I'm trying to remember offhand all the examples he gives. I'm sorry. I'm just blanking on it. Like Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. There's a few examples. Regardless, Rabbi Yosef Heinemann believes strongly that Baruch She'Amar v'haya olam Baruch Hu was originally a messianic doxology, just like Kaddish, just like Uvalat Zion. Originally, Baruch She'Amar was used as a way to end Torah study. So if the first section of Baruch She'Amar, before the Baruch Atah Hashem, was used to end Torah study, how did it end up at the beginning of Pesukei de Zimra? For that, he has a brilliant idea. He says that, think about it. When the Pesukei de Zimra became part of the statutory prayer, became part of the prayer that was considered halachic, the liturgy was changing, because in the time of the Gaonim, and in as Rasadi Gaon says, we volunteered, and in the time of the Rishonim, many people saw Pesukei de Zimra as optional. But once Pesukei de Zimra became halachic, suddenly the beginning of davening was no longer Baruch Hu Hashem Amvorach. It used to be that the beginning of davening was Tfilat Yotzer, right? They would come to shul and they would begin with Baruch She'Amar Vorach, and this was the way it was in many places in the time of the Rishonim. However, once Pesukei de Zimra got a stronger halachic status and became more institutionalized as the introduction to liturgy, to the prayer section of liturgy, that's when they had a new situation. Baruch She'Amar Vorach is not the beginning of davening. How are we going to begin davening with Baruch Atah Hashem? It's kind of weird to start the davening with just a bracha. They wanted some sort of introduction, and because they wanted an introduction, they took their favorite one. They took one of their favorite one of their favorite Beis Hamedrash prayers, which is written in the third person, Baruch She'Amar v'hai olam, and everybody would answer Baruch Hu. So instead of saying Baruch Hu, they would say Baruch Hu, and that was the way people softened the introduction to the davening when they were adding Pesukei de Zimra to the beginning. And all of those phrases in Baruch She'Amar would be responded to the Kahal with Baruch Hu, and that was its original institution. This was how it was done. It was used it originally came from the study hall. It was used as a way to close Torah study. But when they wanted to start off the Pesukei de Zimra with an introduction, they felt like this prayer unit, this prayer rubric of Baruch She'Amar v'hai olam was the most appropriate one to add as a poetic introduction. Again, there's a little bit of a leap there because you have to leap to them choosing one of so many different prayers that were that were Beis Hamedrash prayers, and there's dozens in Medrash. There's dozens, and in Targum there's dozens of Beis Hamedrash prayers. However, he believes strongly, just based on the form of this introduction, that it must have come from the Beis Hamedrash. It's not native to the Beis HaKnesses because it's written in the third person, and because the language comes from Medrash, and because it's messianic in nature. Okay, lastly, we'll just recap. I'm not sure if we need to, but we'll just recap what Ezra Fleischer accomplished. Ezra Fleischer went to the Geniza and unraveled a massive amount of text, early text from the Sidurim of Eretz Yisrael. And one of the things he did find was that and he deconstructed. He's the one last week that we spoke about that figured out how in Eretz Yisrael they used to say Birchas Hashir. But one of the things he found was that there was a prayer book written for roughly, I think it was the 11th century. Yeah, he has the exact dates in his book. But there's a prayer book written for a chazan who was going to say the prayers in front of the Reish Yeshivas of Eretz Yisrael. So because he was going to say it in front of the Reish Yeshiva, clearly it must have been a clean version. It must have been like, halachically accepted. And in their yeshiva, they clearly said Baruch She'Amar. So let me see if I have it in front of me, if I can get through the whole thing. It says they would say Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Hacholam Hakelam Ula B'fi Amod Mishubach Far B'Lashon Kol Chasidav. This is the Birchas Hashir. It's very similar to the opening bracha of Baruch She'Amar. Then you have Yahaluluch Hashem at the end of all the Mizmorim. They would say Yahaluluch Hashem Elokeinu Kol Masecha V'Chasidecha. This is the end of Halal that we say today, which is their Birchas Hashir, with the bracha at the end of Tilas Hashir. And then finally, if I can find it quickly enough, my apologies, they would also say Baruch She'Amar at the end of that. They would also say Baruch She'Amar at the end of that rubric. And here's, I believe this was the manuscript that I found. If you look all the way at the top, I'm sorry, it says, no, this one begins with Birchas Hashir. I'm sorry. But in one of the manuscripts, and I'm sorry, I couldn't find it in time for this year, in one of the manuscripts, it does have the whole Baruch She'Amar, part of the Baruch She'Amar, which was recited in front of the Gaonim from the Yeshivos in Eretz Yisrael. So clearly, the Baruch She'Amar was a very important bracha. The Pesukei de Zimra of the Babylonians did have a major impact on the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, so much so that they decided to adopt it as well. And it's also, I think it's mentioned. It's not mentioned in Sofrim, but they clearly had the minhag to adopt it as well. And the similarities between the first bracha and Baruch She'Amar are very clear. Their Birchas Hashir is very similar to Baruch She'Amar, and he doesn't really make a strong comment about Heinemann's approach versus Elbogen's approach, but he does show definitively that Baruch She'Amar is related to the Birchas Hashir. Sorry, I shouldn't say Baruch She'Amar. The second half of Baruch She'Amar is related to the Birchas Hashir of the Talmud of the yeshivot of Yerushalayim. Now, what's valuable about that piece of information is that once you put two and two together, that the brachos of the yeshivos in Eretz Yisrael and the brachos of the yeshivos in Babel for the introduction to Pesukei de Zimra are very similar. That would lend credence to the idea that it was a very early bracha, and it's very likely that Baruch She'Amar was composed at the time of the early Amoraim. Otherwise, we wouldn't see this kind of we wouldn't see this kind of parallel between the two of them. It seems that in their time, there were quite a few Birchot HaHalel, and these were the most popular Birchot HaHalel, which got used by the various people who would use this voluntary section of prayer called Pesukei de Zimra or called Tfilat Hashir in the custom of Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Apologies to anybody watching on the recording or listening. I was a little bit sick tonight, so I've just expended the last 2% of my battery. And B'ezrat Hashem, next week we will continue with the discussion of the other sections of Pesukei de Zimra, such as Hodu Lashem Kiru Bishmo and Yehi Chavod. I don't know if it'll be next week because next week is Hanukkah, but B'ezrat Hashem we will learn together again soon.